Zero RB or hero RB? The debate that has continued to ravage the fantasy football community. Which is the optimal strategy for best ball? Stay tuned to find out. Welcome to Summer School Club Fantasy's best ball podcast, streaming exclusively on YouTube. I am your host, Austin Amandolia, and here with me, as always, is my co-host, Matt Record. Matt, how are you doing?
I am doing wonderfully today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Gearing up for that Scott Fish draft, which by the time you're watching this, some of them will be done.
Yeah.
People will blaze through those drafts. But if you're here, you should like and subscribe to the channel because episodes of this podcast are going to air Fridays at 6 p.m. And we have 9 shows of content coming at you every day of the week, and that will continue through the regular season once it starts. Also, be sure to check out our cram session episodes where we are breaking down every single matchup that is happening in week 17. It's a way to get a team preview and think about how you should be drafting various teams for best ball. Tonight, we are continuing our positional breakdown series discussing the strategy behind how to draft each position in best ball tournaments. And tonight, we will be discussing running backs. We talked about quarterbacks last week, so if you want to get caught up on that, go check it out. If you have questions, drop them in the chat. We will get to them in the following episodes. I will say if you put a question on our quarterbacks episode, I'm sorry. We're not going to get to that in this episode because of when we're recording this. Just bear with us. We'll get to it in the future, I promise. But if you do have questions, DM us, drop them in the chat. We'll get to them. So, getting to the topic of running backs, we're going to start very similarly to how we talked about quarterbacks. First off, Matt, how many running backs are you drafting when you're drafting in best ball?
Yeah, I typically go for around 5 to 6. I feel like 4 too risky for my taste. Either someone doesn't hit or someone gets injured. That I like to have the 5 or 6. Anything after that, the especially in these big tournaments, you have to start more wide receivers than you have to start running backs. Obviously, we have the flex spot there, but I like to have more depth at the wide receiver spot because of that. So yeah, my magic number is like 5 or 6. Where are you at?
Yeah, I'm right there with you. That 5 or 6 range is where I feel best whenever I'm doing these best ball drafts. And to your point, the reason that is most of these best ball tournaments, you start one quarterback, one tight end, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, and you have a flex spot that could be a receiver, running back, or tight end. Typically, it's ideal to have a wide receiver filling that spot because there's a higher ceiling associated with wide receivers, and so you will tend to bias towards drafting more receivers than you do running backs. And as we did last week, we're going to reference some of the numbers from Best Ball Mania for the Underdog Fantasy Best Ball Mania tournament that happened last year. So the largest data set that we have. And most teams also employed this strategy. 83% of the overall field drafted 5 to 6 running backs in their teams. What is interesting is that playoff teams that advanced into the playoffs, did actually still draft 5 to 6 running backs more. So the field is still not doing this as often as they should be. The teams that advanced did this 84.5% of the time. So it's still a slight advantage if you took that 5 to 6 running back route, which I think is, to Matt's point, associated with the increased ceiling that you get on receivers because they are there. You have more receivers that can hit their ceiling and be adding points to your lineup. Now, Matt, you already alluded to being nervous about drafting 4 running backs. So I'm curious, do you ever do 4 quarterbacks, and should you?
I never do it. I never do it because of my little OCD. I was actually looking through all of my drafts, and I have the same roster construction in each one of them. So I'm always 3 QB, 5 running backs, 7 wide receivers, 3 tight ends. I don't know. I like the symmetry there, the 3 and 3 bookends. But let me play devil's advocate. Is there a world where you can only take 4? I mean, sure, anything is possible. I'm sure some people snuck through, kind of like we talked through with the QB episode. Someone made the finals with 1 QB. I think they are more the anomaly than they are, the solution to the problem. So I would never do it. I guess if you just went super bully RB and you drafted 4 of the top 20 guys or so, fine. Sure, you kind of put all your eggs in that basket anyway, but I would never do it.
Yeah, and I think you have already started to allude to the way that drafting for running backs can work. So, to your point, Matt, it is a very uncommon strategy, and it is not necessarily an advantageous strategy for advancing to the playoffs. So, last year, 7.9% of the field had four running back builds, but teams that advance only had four running backs 6.9% of the time. So, there actually was a slight disadvantage to advancing for those teams that have four running backs. What was interesting, however, is that finalists last year had 7.9% of them had four running back builds. So it matched the field overall. Now, I think this is about the running backs they selected. I don't think this is about something special of a four running back strategy. To your point, Matt, if you took two of the elite running backs, like let's say you took Jahmyr Gibbs and Breece Hall, you probably fared pretty well in the playoffs because they both did really well down the stretch. And I think to your point, if you're taking that kind of anchor bully running back strategy, you may only need four because you're kind of betting on your top tier running backs to start for you every week anyways. Whereas if you're going hero RB or zero RB, doing four is just it's probably throwing your money away because it's such a dart throw. So I'm with you. I'll do it sometimes, but I'm going to do it less than I did it last year because I was intrigued by it last year, and I maybe didn't do it in the most strategic way that I could have. But I've teased it enough, and we've talked about it enough. We've talked about the zero running back. We've talked about the hero running back. Let's just define these things. When if somebody has never played basketball before, and they're hearing the show, they're listening to the show, and they're saying, "What does it even mean to go zero running back?" Let's start with zero running back. What does that mean, Matt?
Yeah, so zero running back is when you kind of punt on the running back position entirely. So you are loading up on wide receivers, tight ends, QBs, even just saying, you know what, I'm going to have no running backs in the first sort of pivotal rounds of the draft, and then just kind of go for volume later to try to make that up.
Yeah, I think it's a great summary. Some people put a specific number on it that you need to go at least 6 rounds of not drafting a running back and for it to count as your running back. That I'm thinking specifically of our friend Joel Worth, who loves the zero running back approach. And when I used to be like dipping my toes and waiting till the 4th round to get a running back, I would say like, "Oh, I kind of went zero running back," and he would chime in the chat and be like, "No, you didn't." But I think the point that Matt gave is the important bit is that you are deciding to take the elite receivers, elite tight ends, elite quarterbacks. You're trying to get a premium on those other positions and bet on getting a good running back later. Why would somebody do zero running back as a strategy?
Well, while other people are busy taking some of those running backs, you are getting, just like you said, the premium spots at other positions, right? So loading up on these big wide receivers, like wide receivers are kind of the new darlings of fantasy, kind of happened recently, where you, in theory, will have the advantage over these other teams at the wide receiver spot, assuming your players hit. Of course, that's always the case for fantasy. So you are getting those advantages at those other positions, and you are banking on the fact that your sort of volume at the running back position later in drafts will be close enough to what those elite productions are getting, that your advantage at the other positions, careens you towards victory.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And I also would add to that there's been kind of a shift in the fantasy community and in the football community and just football trends in general to see that there's not as many 3-down running backs as there used to be that are out there every snap. And the elite running backs, they're taking a lot of wear and tear on their bodies. So there's been some prominent injuries over recent years that I think have pushed people to say, like, I don't want to use one of my first 3 rounds on a running back that could get hurt and miss out the rest of the season. I'd rather wait and just kind of volume shoot later on, like what you're saying, Matt. So it's also kind of an insurance policy to say, I'm not going to spend a ton of draft capital on that running back. Now, what about a hero RB strategy? What are we thinking about when we think hero RB?
Yeah, hero is kind of the opposite, where you are going to take 1 or 2 of the top, I'll say 5 to 10 guys, and then you are just banking on them doing the work. And then you're kind of punt running back after that, because you're saying, yep, these are my 2 guys. They're going to either do it for me or not. So we kind of talked about it a little bit earlier with, should you ever draft 4? If you have 4, you are probably doing hero RB because those 2 RBs are going to be your heroes the entire year. And if they fall, well, you will too.
Yeah, exactly. I'm a big fan of the hero running back strategy. It feels very safe whenever I do it. But I'm curious, Matt, do you have a preference between these two strategies, or will you kind of pick and choose based on the situation which you're employing?
Yeah, I mean, it's always important to be flexible and adapt to where you are in the draft and how things sort of fall to you. I find more often than not, I employ the hero RB. I like the comfort of having 2 of the guys, and we'll talk about ADP in a bit. But some of these people that you can get later in drafts, and you think you'd have to, um, get them just end up just really working out nicely. And I prefer taking the volume shots at wide receivers because there's way more data. You know where the a lot more depth at the wide receiver spot. Where we'll talk about the RB dead zone, but at a certain point, I just don't trust running backs at all. There's obviously some value places, but I feel better having known commodities there and then taking the wide array of wide receivers to make that up.
Yeah, I feel that way as well. I might not necessarily get 2 running backs that early, but I definitely like trying to get 1 running back within the first 4 to 5 rounds. Now, this year, I think it's going to be different than last year was, because last year's ADP landscape, there were many more of these running backs that were higher up in ADP. The running backs have really been pushed down this year. So when we're talking about like what rounds we're taking running backs, it's not necessarily 1-to-1 compared to last year. So I want to flag that to keep that in mind as we're referencing last year, because it truly has shifted a lot. Like, as an example, last year a guy like Najee Harris, Travis Etienne, Joe Mixon, those were all 4th round picks, as was Jahmyr Gibbs. There's kind of been a split in how these players are going. Jahmyr Gibbs is now a front end of the 2nd round. But guys like Najee Harris and Joe Mixon, they've gone down to like the 6th, 7th, 8th round in ADP. So it's almost become more like the tight end spot, where there's these elite guys that you get early, and then there's a bunch of volume shooters late on. To get to some of the numbers on the hero running back strategy, I think most teams are actually deploying this by default. So if we look at teams, let's just call the first 4 rounds where you're getting kind of that hero running back bit. Last year, 82.6% of teams did this. They got their first running back in the first 4 rounds. There was a slight advantage among teams that advanced. So they had 83.1% of those teams had taken a running back in the first 4 rounds. Where there was a more notable example was advantage was in finalists who had taken their first running back 88.4% of the time in the first 4 rounds. Now, I will say, I think this all depends on ADP and on your draft slot, because I think what is notable about that high percentage of finalists taking a running back in the first 4 rounds is that 47.2% of finalists took their running back in the first round of their draft last year. I have not looked at the numbers for this, but Matt, who would you guess that running back was?
I mean, it has
If
to be
you just had,
has to be McCaffrey, right?
it has to be
Has to be
McCaffrey.
McCaffrey.
That is like the only thing that makes sense to me. So I do think that is skewing the numbers. I think having Christian McCaffrey is a cheat code in fantasy football, and that was a huge advantage to getting to the finals last year.
Yeah, and Brees Hall had a really nice year too. I could
That's
see
true.
him not ruining your build if you took him in the first round.
That is very true, especially if you were trying to take him early. But
Well,
he
because
was,
remember last year he was coming off the injury, we didn't know, so you got him at a pretty nice value.
yeah, he was going off in the 3rd round too, which was really, really nice. So it does seem like a lot of people are taking this kind of anchor RB strategy. I will say, like, it is very uncommon for players to get it to wait until the 8th round to get their quarterback. Out of players in the field, only 1.9% of players got their first running back in round 8 or later. I do think you can wait too long on some of this. I do feel better having one of my main running backs up there early. But when I'm looking at my 2nd and 3rd running backs, how about that, Matt? What are you thinking about taking those second and third running backs? Are you trying to still kind of spread them out? Is there a big gap? Like how are you thinking about filling out your running back room in these drafts?
Yeah, I typically wait a little bit, and when we're talking about this ADP, and we'll get to sort of the dead zone, but like to get my top 5, top 10 guy right within the first 4 rounds, like we sort of talked about, and then I wait until the end of sort of the second tier of guys, and kind of trying to pay attention to the board, what other teams are drafting. Typically, that means I'm looking at about, just doing some quick mental math, 6th round or so, 5th or 6th round for my second, getting someone that I know is established on a team that has some pretty decent upside, that doesn't have the kind of questions that people after that tier drop off sort of have.
Yeah, and I think that feels right to me. I know, I don't know if you listen to them. Someone I listen to a ton is the Fantasy Footballers DFS and Betting Show with Kyle
Mhm.
Brignoni, Matthew Betts. They talk a lot about getting 4 receivers by round 7. That's kind of their rule of thumb of how they like to approach these. Well, if you are filling out your room, you can fit 2 running backs in there in those first 7 rounds as well, which I think is something that teams do a lot. When you look at the numbers, there is a high trend of players getting to running backs in those first 7 rounds. 82% of the field did this last year. Only 80% of teams that advanced last year actually did this, which I thought was fascinating. But then you look at the finalist, 95% of finalists, sorry, that I highlighted too many cells. Sorry, 82% of finalists did hit that 7th round, did have 2 running backs before the 7th round. So it kind of matched the field. And I think that's kind of how I approach it. Now, again, that might be a little bit different this year. You might be able to go a little bit longer because the running backs have been pushed down the board this year because of how valuable the receivers are. But now I think the main thing we want to talk about and thinking about how when you should start drafting your second, third, fourth, fifth running back is figuring out where the dead zone is. Now, Matt, can you talk about like the concept of the dead zone, and then we'll talk about what we think the dead zone is? Like first, what do we even mean when we say the dead zone?
Sure. I like to think dead zone. If that term doesn't mean anything to you, I also think about it in like tiers. So you have certain groupings of players that we expect to have certain types of outcomes, right? So tier 1, you have your top tier guys like Christian McCaffrey, Brees Hall, whatever. Tier 2, sort of the next one down, not as good as that tier 1, but still have established roles and can be good. So when we talk about the dead zone, is at a certain point after a certain number of tiers, we end up at the spot of, we'll say, 10 to 15 players that there's a significant drop off between the tier before them and then them in terms of perceived value or our comfort, like the higher variability in terms of outcomes for their season. So the dead zone is, if you are, once you're in there, there's not a whole lot of difference between players, nor is there a whole lot of necessarily upside there. So I don't know if you would approach it any differently, but I like to think of it in that tiered format.
Yeah, I think of it very similarly. It's a portion of the running back room where I want to be very careful. I want to get only the guys that I like, but I want to just not force it. Like I think that the problem you can get into with the dead zone is if you have waited on running back so long that you're like, I need a running back now, and then you end up just taking a player in that dead zone who's not good because you ended up forcing a running back into that spot instead of taking the value when it was there. So where do you think the dead zone is this year based on the current ADP landscape?
Yeah, for me, the top 20 guys are pretty solid in terms of their position on the team. While they might not all be 3 down backs, we know they're going to be involved. So, you know, top 20. After that, looking at the ADP from 21 on, I have more questions than answers about these guys. Not to say they can't have a great year and someone could do some stuff, but I'm talking Najee Harris, Jonathan Brooks, Zamir White, Jalen Warren, DeAndre Swift, Zach Moss, James Conner, Raheem Mostert, Tony Pollard, Brian Robinson. If you've been paying attention to these names, like there's a whole lot of questions. Like we have no idea what they're going to do. I wouldn't feel great about saying, yep, Jonathan Brooks, you're my RB2, who I'm relying on the entire year. Because we don't know. I mean, obviously he's a rookie. We don't know what he's going to do. But to me, everyone above them, I'd feel comfortable with relying on. But for me, it's there. What about you?
Yeah, I agree. The only thing is I do actually kind of want to put Najee Harris into that top
Oh, sure.
21.
So
because
you still believe?
I still believe.
Okay.
Arthur Smith somehow has me believing still. And then I think Jonathan Brooks to me really solidifies that break for me where the dead zone begins. And I think it kind of goes for quite a while. I feel like there's about 20 picks of running backs where I want to be very, very careful. But I think I'm curious your thoughts on this. The first opening I am now, I know this is actually different than what we talked about, so I'm going to throw you for a little bit of a loop here, Matt, because as I'm looking at it again and second guessing myself, I'm thinking that the first running back after Najee Harris, where I start to feel like, okay, here's another string of running backs I feel interested in, is RB28, Ezekiel Elliott. That's where I'm like, I feel like I'm ready to dip my toes back in. And he kind of starts a little bit of a run with Jerome Ford, Austin Eckler, and Zach Charbonnet. What about you? How do you feel about that for like where the dead zone is over and we can start getting some value plays?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think there are certain players, and all of this is related to when you are get them, when you're going to get them, when they will be available for you. So we're talking like if you already have your running backs figured out, or at least your first two or three, you can be filling up on wide receivers this entire time. And then, yeah, I like the value you can get for Ezekiel. Yeah, I think he's going to have a perfectly fine year. He had a fine year with the pass this year. Runs hard. The Cowboys have a great offense, so I feel really good about that. I do think Jerome Ford provides value. Yeah, Austin Eckler going off the board at RB40. I don't know why he's going RB40. He's been a top 10 guy pretty recently. He signed a new deal with the Commanders. So I guess a different team. But they're not going to just throw Jaden Daniels into the thick of things. Like they're going to be utilizing him. And the fact that you can get him for basically nothing, that's incredible. So yeah, I would say about there is right. I'm still a sucker for the James Conner, Raheem Mosterts of the world. Uh,
Mhm.
like because Mostert's there, I don't love Devin Ashane. So I like Mostert a little more. But yeah, again, the value really picks up there in that late RB30 because they're essentially just taking a flyer.
Yeah. I agree with that. And again, this isn't to say you shouldn't draft any running backs in that dead zone that we're calling it right now. Like just like Matt said, James Conner, I love him where he's being drafted right now. I think he's still totally fine. Raheem Mostert, I love that value there. So I will still take running backs in this section of the draft, but I want to be thoughtful about where I'm at in this draft and not get myself into a position where I'm panicking on running back. And as just like a brief example of that, like if I've gotten to a point where I need both a running back and a quarterback in this zone, like I might rather just like take a guy like Joe Burrow at quarterback, or Kyler Murray is in this range where this kind of running back drop off starts. Dak Prescott, Jordan Love, like there's a lot of good value here. So I might try and hedge my bets a little bit differently depending on how my roster has been built up until this time. Now we're gonna. Oh, before we talked off-season narratives, I forgot the part where I summarize all of the takeaways. So don't forget when you're drafting running backs, we think you should be drafting 5 to 6 running backs. This is the most common build and the most successful build. If you are drafting a ton, it may be worth drafting 4 running backs on a team or two if you are drafting elite running backs early, and that's the key part of that strategy. Is it's a differentiator. You're going heavy to at least 2 solid running backs in the first 4 rounds, and then you might get a couple before the first 10 rounds so that you have a solid core, but it's kind of a zig while everyone's zagging move. So you don't want to like wait until the 15th round and then take 4 running backs. That's probably not a recipe for success. And then between zero RB and hero RB, it is a bit of personal preference. However, I will say, I think depending on where your draft slot is, hero RB can be a more advantageous strategy. Like if you have the one spot, you should just say, I'm doing hero RB. I'm taking Christian McCaffrey. Like he is a cheat code. So I tend to lean that route in general, but especially if my draft slot relies on it. And then just be careful in the RB dud zone, kind of that RB 21 to 38 range. Make sure that you're taking players that you think have high upside and not getting stuck and forced to take running backs there. So speaking of one of those running backs in the RB to dead zone, we're going to talk off-season narratives, and we're going to discuss. This is where we discuss some of the key news recently, some of the beat reporters, stuff that's been reported, and talk about how it should impact our best ball strategy. So Here's a quote from Johnny Venerable from Phoenix Sports. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce that acronym, which is PHNX Sports. This was on the Roto World Football Show. So this is Johnny Venerable. He covers the Arizona Cardinals. Says, quote, I think Trey Benson is the heir apparent to James Conner in 2025, which is not this year. I don't think fantasy enthusiasts are going to get what they want this year. When James is healthy, he's going to get the bulk share of that workload. Matt, what are you doing with this information, knowing that right now James Conner is being drafted as the running back 27 on Underdog, and Trey Benson is only 4 spots behind him as the RB 31?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this just at a higher level encapsulates something that we all, us fantasy degens, need to always keep in mind, especially for redraft and these best ball tournaments that are not dynasty. It's just 1 year. What you're drafting for is the value for this year. Is that we love our rookies, we love our shiny toys. We get all hyped up because in the off season, because there's nothing else to talk about. So we fall in love with these rookies and through the draft and everything, and obviously in OTAs and running, without pads on, everyone looks great. But they have yet to do it yet, right? So especially in these tournaments where you are relying on getting value, especially at that point there, I shy away from the rookies because I like to see them do it first. And in the real world, where they're trying to win football games, when James Conner is healthy, he's been proven to be reliable, right? He's been a good professional NFL running back. Never mind the fantasy perspective. So yeah, they're gonna wait for Trey Benson until they have to use him, right?
Yeah.
So for me, it's just a word of caution: don't rely on rookies if you don't have to.
Yeah, I'm definitely there. I'm not necessarily relying on Trey Benson. I do like him at times, but honestly, his ADP is so close to James Conner, and I do think Conner ends up being the lead back. The issue here is if Conner gets hurt, and I do think there's a chance he will miss some games because he doesn't have a good track record of playing a full NFL season. So Trey Benson will probably get some snap at some point. The issue is, when does that happen? And I think that's kind of the thing that you have to decide you're betting on. If Trey Benson was going later, or if I already have my wide receiver core established, then I might feel more comfortable taking Trey Benson. But I'm probably going to go ahead and lean towards James Conner unless that ADP gap starts to increase between the two. Next up on this segment, we have a quote from Brian Callahan, who is the new head coach of the Tennessee Titans, on the official Titans podcast, OTP. He says, quote, he was asked, I should say, before I throw this quote out there, he was asked about who he's excited to see in training camp, who he's ready to see put pads on. And he says, quote, I'm really looking forward to seeing Tyjae Spears and Tony Pollard. Those guys, I think, are going to be really fun players to watch play in training camp and preseason as we get started. This was an interesting one. And I'm not going to tell you the context that I read this in. I want to hear your initial reaction to hearing this come out of Brian Callahan's mouth.
Yeah, I'm excited to see them too. However, I think this is going to be posing a problem for us fantasy players because which one's going to be the guy? Probably split workloads. That's better for real life NFL purposes. Fewer hits, less chance of injury. But for us, it's a big question mark. That's what my mind is like. Yeah, I'm excited to see them too. But which one's going to be the guy? Now there is where they're being drafted. Let's see. Tony Pollard is going as RB 29. Tyjae Spears is RB 33. So about the same range, and that ADP is sort of indicative of we don't know. We don't know. Now, if you guess right any given week, and the glory of best ball, right, is you just have to have one of them spike for one of the weeks, and they'll be fine. So I'm not necessarily shying away from them, so to speak, for our best ball purposes here. But for redraft, I might let someone else take that risk.
Yeah, I think it's very true for redraft. And for best ball, I think I didn't even plan this out. I did not plan for them to be the same number of RB spots away from each other as James Conner and Trey Benson. But it works out perfectly. And I think it tells us actually a lot of information. It's a really good lesson on how to differentiate between uncertain running back rooms. So In Arizona, we're getting all the indications that it is James Conner's job as long as he's healthy. And yet they're still being drafted right next to each other. In Tennessee, it sounds like they're going to both be going pretty 50-50, like it's 1A, 1B situation. And that was the framework that this was provided and was saying, it was retweeted to say, like, hey, like every time that Brian Callahan has talked about the running back room, he's talked about both of those guys in the same sentence. So he seems to have the vision that they're splitting this backfield. It's ambiguous. And so for me, I'm just taking the cheaper one, which right now is Tyjae Spears. Whereas in Arizona, I think I'm going to just avoid Trey Benson until his ADP falls, or we get news that he might actually get more of the workload, because it seems less of a split there than it does in Tennessee. With that, we're going to get to our listener questions, which we do have one listener question. Reminder that if you want to ask a question or have a question, you can drop it in the comment section or DM either one of us, and we will get to it in the following episode. And this question comes from our friend Ryan Weiss, who asked this to us kind of in our Club Fantasy Discord. It's an internal Discord. I'm sorry, it's not one that you can join, not yet. I'll talk to Josh if people want that, which actually I think would be fun. But he asked us basically, should you be handcuffing running back? So I purposely left this here because it's a listener question, but it applies to the running back topic. And he was saying he doesn't know how he feels about it. Now, first off, we need to make sure folks know what we mean when we say handcuffing, and then let's talk about what we think about whether or not you should be doing it.
Yeah, so handcuffing is when you take the backup of one of your players. Essentially, why would you do this? If your star player gets hurt, you have the person that's right behind them. So, for example, if you happen to have Bijan Robinson there from the Falcons, you might take Tyler Algier later. So you basically have the entire running back room there for the Falcons. So you're going to have someone there regardless of if someone gets injured.
Yeah. And the peak example of this used to be Dalvin Cook and Alexander Madison back in the day when Alexander Madison and Dalvin Cook were a thing. Now, I don't even know who you would actually think of as like the epitome of this, but that's the concept. Now, do you think this is something that we should be doing to ourselves, is what I'm thinking? Like, if you take, like that example you gave, if you take Bijan Robinson, are you taking Tyler Algier as well?
I am not doing it intentionally. I'm not going into, I mean, there's certain things you do in these drafts where you kind of have a plan. Like, I like my late round QB wide receiver stack, like we talked about in the QB episode. Like, there's certain things it's like, okay, I would like to, or if I can make a stack work, I'm going to intentionally try to do that. In terms of handcuffing RBs, you are limiting your upside by only saying, I'm taking the Falcons or RB room, right? Because maybe they're just terrible the entire year. You don't have any variability. Like, you are limiting your upside, because in order for Tyler Algier to pay off, really, you need Bijan Robinson to get hurt, which you never want to bank on anyone getting hurt. Like, kind of a waste of a spot. That being said, there are certain values I like later in the rounds where I think there's a chance some of these, especially rookie running backs, have a chance, and I like where they're ADP. So I think I have one stack so far, again, by accident, where I have Rachaad White and Bucky Irving, just because where I was at the end of the draft. Like, I actually think Bucky Irving might be sneaky good. I'm not totally bought in on Rachaad White. So, like, yeah, I'll take that one. But again, that wasn't intentional, because I don't like limiting your upside. But if it happens, there are worse things in the world.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm not going out of my way to do it. I mean, I'm more so, I don't even know that I think I would call it handcuffing, what I would do it, because I'll sometimes get running backs from the same backfield, but it's more in these ambiguous backfields, like what we just talked about with Tennessee, where what instead I'm betting on is that some weeks one of them is going to pop off, another week it's going to be a different guy. The team I think about the most with this right now is honestly Baltimore. Like, Derrick Henry seems like the main guy there, which he probably will be most weeks, but Keaton Mitchell is interesting at times. Now, he may not be back healthy, but like, if he were healthy, if Justice Hill were healthy, like there are these other running backs in that room that have a lot of explosiveness. I think Miami was a great example of this last year, where Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane were both really good. They could get you those ceiling weeks. Having both of them actually was not an awful strategy, because you were getting the Miami running back room, and that was a very valuable running back room to have access to. But when I'm drafting a guy like Christian McCaffrey, I'm not touching another San Francisco running back outside of that, because if Christian McCaffrey goes down, my lineup's dead anyways. So I'm going to focus on other running backs that I think have high upside that can help make my lineup better if injury happens elsewhere. But remember, when you're doing best ball, you got to bet draft as if you are correct. You're drafting as if everything is going right. And so you don't want to start second guessing yourself and handcuffing your running backs, because then it's just going to, overall, it will decrease your ceiling.
Yeah, draft a player because you like the player, not because, oh, I need to handcuff, my guy.
Yeah. And Matt is a very conservative best ball player. So if Matt is saying that, you should take it to the bank.
Fact.
But that is going to be all for this week. Before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on some notifications, follow Club Fantasy FFL on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We go live every day. As I mentioned earlier, we have 9 episodes. If you want to practice the strategic discussions we have on this show, check out Masterclass on Tuesdays at 8:30 with Stacy, Perez, and Gator J, where they do live best ball drafts every week. We also have dynasty shows that go on Sundays and Thursdays. We have mock drafts happening Mondays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. We have a DFS golf show that posts on Tuesday, and our flagship show, No Pun Intended, airs on Wednesdays. And don't forget, when the season starts, we'll have our DFS podcast return. You just need to be following us. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. And for Matt Record, I'm Austin Amandolia. This has been Summer School. And remember, defense wins championships, offense wins fantasy football, and best ball wins money. See you next time.